Hello, my name's Claire Jones and I'm part of the Curtin English and Literature Conference Committee, and it's great to be bringing you a lecture today about Australian literature, representation and identity. I've been an English teacher for nearly 20 years and I've been teaching at both secondary and tertiary level. I've been an examiner and chief marker for both English and literature, and I hope that some of that experience comes through to you today here as part of a lecture. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which Curtin Bentley campus is located, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today's lecture topic is going to look at a range of ATAR literature prescribed texts, trace the ways that textual representations of Australia helps us to understand ideas about culture, identity and context in those texts, and relate it back to your syllabus as well. So really this is a lecture about cultural identity, and cultural identity is the idea of belonging to a group. It's part of a person's self-conception and self-perception and is related to nationality, ethnicity, religion, class, generation, locality, or any kind of social group that has its own distinct culture. So there are lots of ways in which we can understand how we describe ourselves and describe our culture. You can also lack belonging to one of those cultures as well, and that can be a definitive part of an identity construction also. So cultural identity is something that is central to the way that we understand literature, but it's also an essential component of how we understand the literature course. If we look at the syllabus document that you'll all have had exposure to, so the ATAR literature syllabus, what we can see is that the course focuses on the study of literary texts and developing students as independent, innovative and creative learners and thinkers who appreciate the aesthetic use of language, evaluate perspectives and evidence, and challenge ideas and interpretations. The Literature ATAR course explores how literary texts construct representations, shape perceptions of the world, and enable us to enter other worlds of imagination. It also goes on to explain that students enjoy, or hopefully you do enjoy, and respond to creatively and critically to texts drawn from the past and present and from Australian and other cultures. That they or you reflect on what these texts offer you as individuals, as members of Australian society and as world citizens. So what we can see from this rationale from the syllabus is that in actual fact, culture and identity are central components of what you're studying as literature students. You're asked to engage with the way texts construct representations, how they shape our perceptions of the world. You're also asked to do that specifically in relation to Australian and other cultures. So today's lecture about Australian literature is really tapping into that idea, a common component of the course of everybody's study across Year 12, all across WA for ATAR literature students, is going to be studying Australian texts. So we're going to be looking today at the way we understand all the contextual components that underpin our understanding of Australian literature, and how we might come to understand Australian identity, how Australian identity has been represented in texts, and the types of perspectives that are studied in relation to Australian texts as well. I like to use a quote to help me to understand the importance of literature that comes from Marc Ingenue and Robert Barsky. They wrote an essay in 2004 entitled, "What Can Literature Do?" The quote that I like says, "Literature is the discourse which, present in the world, comes and speaks with the words of the tribe, after all other discourses have said what they have to say, especially those about certitude and identity. Literature seems to have the mandate to listen to them, to return their echoes, even as it interrogates and confronts them." Now this quote, I think, is a really helpful way of understanding the things that we've just spoken about in relation to cultural identity and how cultural identity more generally, representation and perspective work within the literature syllabus. So this quote by Ingenue and Barsky is saying that literature is one of those types of speaking that is able to tell us how people understand themselves. That when all other discourses, so all other subjects, they can talk about how people feel and think as well. We can do it in history, we can do it in sociology, we can do it in sciences. But what literature can do is that it comes and speaks with the words of the tribe, and that has the ability to listen to what people are saying, then return their echoes and interrogate and confront the things that are part of our human experience. So to me, that's what's most important about studying literature, is that literature remains. It's something that stays with us. It remains as a document of the past, but it's also something that we continue to re-engage with and think about how it continues to impact us today. It's of the tribe, it's of the people. So today's lecture is broken into 3 parts. The first part will look at Australia as a constructed space, an identity which was imposed upon both the landform as well as the people who were inhabiting Australia during a particular historical period. We'll then move forward to look at the way that Australia became a self-defined identity and then how it moved into a post-colonial identity. So this pretty much takes a chronological perspective, but we should be able to break that down into also phases of a changing cultural identity for Australia. So part 1, the Great Australia, the Great Southland, a European construction. This is a title that I've used to try and unpack the way Australia was seen from the outside. Now, this isn't to diminish or to not acknowledge the very rich cultural background that Australia had from the Indigenous people of the land before European settlement, but it's to acknowledge that the term Australia is a European construction in itself. So Australia, the Great Southland, or as we can see from this great world map from 1570 from Ortelius, it describes Australia as an unknown land, a land that wasn't known to people. And if you look in the very bottom right hand of that map, you can see what is probably the top end of Western Australia, just mapped out for us, really close to the 3-headed giant serpent, which is an interesting comparison. But what this map is really telling us is that not only was Australia unknown to the Europeans in terms of a landform, it hadn't been mapped, it had only very vaguely been mapped. It was saying that it existed in the European imagination from this period in time onwards. And it was this unknown space, a space that we didn't know very much about. And so what did we do? We filled it with things that are fearful, things that confuse us or confound us, or things that threaten us. And so you can see parts of this globe that were unmapped and sort of imagined have quite mythical creatures as part of them. So the 3-headed serpent being one, there's also a giant crocodile in the middle of the ocean as well. So it sort of tells us that Australia as a concept within the European imagination was a space of terror, a space of unknown landscapes as well as unknown people. And this is really the foundation of that cultural identity of Australia from that period in time forward. Unfortunately, 100 years on, it doesn't really get much better. Australia is still being reported to the European imagination and the European populace as somewhere that is full of terror. This is an engraving that came from a series in 1647 depicting the shipwreck of the Batavia. So off the West Australian coast here, a Dutch ship heading to Java, full of important riches, ready to be traded with the people of Java. But unfortunately, they were shipwrecked on the Abrolhos Islands, and the captain at the time, Pelsart, took off to Java trying to find some help, and Cornelius took over, sort of mutinied on these islands. And in his time, months, while they were trying to find a rescue party, Cornelius reigned in this time of terror, and eventually he was killed by the other mutineers, but another reign of terror came along. So it was a time of murder, it was a time of rape, it was a time of unbridled terror. And this was reported back to the European people in various ways through reports, newspaper, very early newspapers at the time. But these engravings became part of that idea, that imagination of Australia as well. A little bit later, an English explorer, William Dampier, you can see from the map there that we start to map out the Australian coastline in a little bit more detail. We understand a little bit more of the facts of Australia in terms of landform. But he also brought back some accounts of Indigenous people. Not the most favourable accounts, unfortunately. He says that not only was the country waterless and the inhabitants the most miserablest people in the world, and then went on to complain about flies at length in his diary, but he actually spoke in really derogatory terms about the people of Australia as well. So we can see within that European imagination, we're starting to take, Australia itself is starting to take the form of something that is perhaps sinister, perhaps something to be fearful of. But this was really just a story being constructed about Australia at that time in history. So if we think about those pre-colonial Australian times, using purely European terms here, we can see an Australia that is a little bit threatening, perhaps something to be fearful of. But of course, it becomes a colonial colony of Britain in 1788. And so an imposed identity isn't just part of an imaginary landscape for the Europeans, it becomes part of their reality as they move here to Australia. But then we start to see this frontier conflict also be part of what people in Australia were experiencing and also what was being reported back to Britain and other parts of the world. We start to see here some juxtaposition between cultures as well. We have Indigenous or a traditional culture alongside a European or modern culture. And I don't mean modern as in superior, I mean modern as in terms of the ideologies that were circulating in Europe at that time. And I'm not trying to place these two things in opposition to each other, just letting you know that these are two very different cultural groups occupying the same space at any given time on the Australian land and associated islands. They're different worldviews. Okay, the Indigenous people came with a different understanding about many things. They'd been there for a long time on the Australian land as well. The Europeans came with a very separate set of understandings, beliefs, ideologies, different epistemologies, ways of understanding, ways of knowing about themselves. So what we see from 1788 to 1900 onwards is really this idea of, a different way of understanding Australia that is a frontier. Two different groups in connection with each other, with different perspectives on nature, different perspectives on family, on wealth. Even the term country has a really different understanding whether you're looking at colonial Australia or Indigenous Australia. So to understand this, we return to a really central component of so many literary texts that you'll have come across in your study of literature in year 11 and 12, and that's the idea of the Enlightenment. We need to understand the Enlightenment to understand lots of European texts, but we also need to understand the Enlightenment to understand Australian texts, as well as American texts, as well as ideas even of post-colonialism. So we know that the Enlightenment was a school of thought that came about in the late 17th century and moved through to the 19th century. And it was really a time of religious change where faith was suddenly tempered by reason. So we started to question the role of God, and we started to understand that other things can provide explanation for the world around us and who we are as individuals, not just God. So God becomes displaced from the centre of understanding for many, many groups within Europe at the time. We start to see different social structures as technology advances. We have different forms of structuring cities that came about as part of the Industrial Revolution. We also see social mobility as part of that as well. There's a very clear movement towards humanism. And we see all of those ideas of rationalism that inform scientific discovery of the time as well. We also see this as a large time of progress. And I think we can also understand that this is a time of revolution for lots of different communities as well. We see the French Revolution, the American Revolution at that time. So it's a time of upheaval in terms of the way that we understand and how we believe. Now, this is the height of when Australia becomes a colony as well. And what we actually understand from this is that Australia becomes an Enlightenment laboratory. So we see settlers, as well as the original explorers, treating Australia like their own laboratory. If you think of Joseph Banks on board the ship with Captain Cook, he was collecting specimens, he was going out and trying to understand Australia. And this was really the way that Australia was treated by those colonial settlers as well. They were experimenting with different ways of treating a criminal class, so bringing convicts to Australia and establishing tickets of leave and how they would reinstate them into a free society. We also saw a lot of experimentation when it came to how we would then have Australia as a pastoral nation, how we would develop agriculture, all of those sorts of things. But it was really the way that we started to experiment with the way we understand humans that was really quite interesting in Australia, and in sometimes, quite a problematic aspect of Australian history as well. So the Enlightenment really brought forward ideas of equality, compassion, reform. We've got to, just think of the French Revolution and the ideas that underpinned that. But it was also, in reality or in practice, a time of brutality, of unjust treatment for a lot of people that weren't part of the ruling classes. And it was also a time of dehumanisation. And if we think of Australia, it was a time of dehumanisation certainly for convicts, but absolutely a time of dehumanisation for Aboriginal people here in Australia as well. And you've only got to turn to a few pages of an Australian history to understand that. So from 1788 through to about the 1890s, we can really talk about this as the first period in trying to define Australia's cultural identity, a culture that is centred around this convict experience, and very little is really recorded about the Indigenous experience. What we see is this convict era where we have new colonies, a pastoral expansion, lots of land allocation. All you've got to do is read Australian literature from any time and think about the significance of fences and the way that fences figure as symbols within Australian literature. We can also see it as a time of prosperity, success, and the beginning of a lot of support for federation, of trying to move away from that original identity that was about convicts, that was about terror, that was about the hardships that we were going to face. But it really formed or consolidated the bush myth or the Australian legend. It's a legend of egalitarianism where people could fight hard, work hard to become equal, that we would be stoic people, that we would have endurance, and that we would be guided by honesty. Now, some of these things might seem contradictory to that original convict idea, but really it was that idea of the underdog, that we started to see Australians and Australia as a new place. We start to also see archetypes emerge of the Aussie battler, of the stockman, the drover. We have a lot of characters that emerge as people that can survive. What we do also find, though, is that these are incredibly masculine figures. There are very few archetypes that emerge from this period of Australian culture and Australian literature that are female. There are very few that emerge that are anything other than being from a British background. There are also very few that emerge that are of Indigenous background. If we do have Indigenous figures, they often come forward as sort of mystical figures, but not really real figures. They tend to be part, again, of an imaginary rather than realism. So what can we say about Australian cultural identity? This is a really good place for us to finish the first part of our lecture, leaving you with two important quotes. So this is firstly a quote by Levi Strauss. So he is somebody, not the Levi Strauss that makes jeans, but Levi Strauss, who is a theorist, a social theorist, and he says that myths tend to supply absences, to play out resolutions of conflicts that cannot, in reality, be resolved. So he's saying that when we can't figure out the answer to something, whether it's through exploration or whether it's through finding some consensus within our culture, we play out conflicts with myths. We invent something that tells us the story to give us an answer. So when there's something that baffles us, that bewilders us, like that Nautilus map that you saw earlier in the lecture, we put something there from our imagination. We think, okay, well, what might be there? So Graham Turner, an Australian studies scholar, says, our myth of the land is of this kind, unarguably harsh in its extremes, bizarre in its affectation of beauty. It is just these most harsh and bizarre aspects of the land which we perversely enshrine in our national character. So he's saying when we don't know what to say about ourselves, or when we're unsure, or when we're trying to find a new way forward, we go to myths about harshness, about bizarreness. And it's those harsh and bizarre aspects of our land that we enshrine in our national character. So we're going to pause here, and this is a chance for you to just summarise any notes, or maybe a chance to go back and make some notes in relation to your texts, how they might relate to some of the history and cultural history that has been explained in this part of the lecture. Okay, moving on to part 2 of this lecture about Australian literature. Now we're going to be looking to the idea of self-definition, refining identity and a new nation. So this is an opportunity for us to just reflect a little bit on the information that we heard in part 1 about how an original identity was imposed, and then how Australia moved towards its own self-defined identity. And this is an opportunity for us to move more into the text, so maybe feel more like a lit lecture than perhaps the previous part of the lecture, which was more historically based, or contextually based, if we use the language of our discourse. So one thing that we can think about from 1890 onwards is that we start to see a very clear self-definition coming through in various types of artistic expression. One easy way, I guess, in terms of time for us here in the lecture is to move to some artworks that emerged as part of the Heidelberg School of Art in the late 1800s. And so this first image here is Tom Roberts' painting called Shearing the Rams. So what we see here is the shearing shed, an iconic sort of location that we see in a lot of Australian art as well as Australian literature. And we can see this masculine identity as well emerging, this person of the land who is tough, stoic, full of endurance. And it's quite an egalitarian space, the shearing shed as well. So many of those things that we were speaking about earlier as the myths of Australian identity coming forward as we start to self-define who Australia is as a nation and as a people. If we move forward to another one of Tom Roberts' paintings, Bailed Up, we see another side of Australia, a side, I guess, that pays some acknowledgement to our convict past, but something that is also part of Australian identity, but also Australian literary archetypes, and that's the bushranger. So another masculine identity, I guess, but one that we can easily identify in lots of Australian works of literature as well. And if we move forward one more to Frederick McCubbin, this is called Down on His Luck. So this is our drover. And here we see him in that isolated space. The thing you'll see in common with all of those images is there's a very clear an Australian aesthetic. An aesthetic that is different to the way Australia had been depicted previously in artworks. It's a way of trying to establish realism that is giving us a real sense of Australian landscape, the types of trees that are here in Australia, the type of light that we might have, the different colours. Up until the Heidelberg School, our environment was painted quite differently, and it looked much more like a European landscape. And just in the same way in literature, we start to see similar things occurring. So realism becomes the dominant mode of expression, but we also start to see the Australian landscape and the Australian people rendered to look more like a distinct group of people, or the landscape to be a very different landscape to that of Europe. So we start to see Australia, instead of being a experimental location for the Enlightenment, where we had, conflict between the settlers and those Indigenous inhabitants, or convicts and their jailers. Instead, we start to see Australia as a lucky country. It's still an isolated country, and that's an important component of the identity as well. It remains an egalitarian country, but it's a brave country. It can be fierce, but not in terms of it being a scary place any longer, but with brave people who can inhabit that relatively difficult landscape. It still remains a brutal country, though. It's still quite violent in lots of ways. So to reaffirm some of those archetypes that we understand, the drover, the stockman, we then start to see the Anzac come through. We see lost children a lot in Australian literature as well, the bushranger, the underdog, the battler. We do get this divide between the bush and the city at times, and that can be important to literary representations. And that Indigenous mysticism coming through as well. These are traditional representations of Australian people, Australian identities, but they're also literary archetypes that come through, character types that we seem to see happen again and again in Australian literature. One example here is Clancy of the Overflow. So this is a poem by A.B. Patterson, Banjo Patterson. I'm not going to read it all out to you, but this is an opportunity for you to pause, read through the poem, and just try and identify some of those archetypes that I was speaking of earlier. And also just try and think about, as a student of literature, what can you see occurring within the poem that is attempting to give us a sense of this place, of this location? So what you need to think about here is, how is Patterson using poetic form? Okay, how might he be using particular techniques of poetry? So how might rhyme, rhythm play a part in telling us the story of Clancy of the Overflow? We can also think about the types of language devices that might be being used. But essentially, this helps us to understand that early moment of Australian self-definition. So, and that's the reason why Banjo Patterson remains such a popular poet in Australian culture. After writers like Patterson in the early stages of Australian Federation had defined that idea of the Australian outback, the drover, those very masculine figures, we do start to see other figures emerging as well. Now we're going to look at an example from a writer, Christina Stead. Maybe not somebody who is as popular or as well known as Banjo Patterson, but what Christina Stead does, and by this stage we're looking at the mid-1900s, she starts to identify a different figure within Australian literature, a female figure, but it's quite clear that she's an outsider. This female figure is an outsider. So I'm going to read just a short part of this, but please feel free to pause and go through this excerpt in more detail. And this just gives us a little bit of an understanding of the way Australian literature begins to develop ideas about Australia. What's interesting about this passage, it comes from the very beginning of a novel called For Love Alone. And this is a character who leaves Australia. She takes herself off, her name's Teresa, and she takes herself off to Europe to try and understand what it is to be part of that bigger global experience. And this is another trend in Australian literature after that period of federation, that a lot of writers, as well as a lot of Australians, felt that they needed to still connect to that European centre. And Teresa is certainly doing that. And what this does is it constructs an Australia that is very separate from the rest of the world. And in this case, in this text, we see it as almost in opposition to the rest of the world. So if we just read the very beginning, we'll understand that. In the part of the world Teresa came from, winter is in July. Spring brides marry in September. And Christmas is consummated with roast beef, suckling pig, and brandy-laced plum pudding at 100 degrees in the shade near the tall pine tree loaded with gifts and tinsel as in the old country, and old carols have rung out all through the night. The island continent lies in the water hemisphere. On the eastern coast, the neighbouring nation is Chile, though it is far, far east, Valparaiso being more than 6,000 miles away in a straight line. Her northern neighbours are those of the Timor Sea, the Yellow Sea. To the south is that cold, stormy sea full of earth-wide rollers which stretches from there without land south to the pole. The other world, the old world, the land hemisphere, is far above her as it is shown on maps drawn upside down by old world cartographers. From that world, and particularly from a scarcely noticeable island up towards the North Pole, the people came, all by steam, or their parents all by sail. Now you can read on further and find more instances, but I'm just going to pick out some of the language features that we can see operating here within this passage to help us to understand Australia as distinctly different from the rest of the world, distinctly separate as well. So we begin that passage with Teresa, somebody who is set aside from the rest of the world, and we know that because her environment is described as being contrary to what our expectations might tell us. Now, as an Australian reading now in 2020, it doesn't necessarily seem so odd that winter is July and spring brides marry in September and that Christmas is a hot time of the year. But of course, this is opposite to the old world, as it says later on in the passage. So it's very clearly told to us in the beginning that Teresa comes from a place that is topsy-turvy. It's upside down. It's different to what everybody expects. It goes on to explain to us in quite a lot of detail with descriptive language the way in which it is so separate from the rest of the world, that it is this island continent that is surrounded by sea, which is logical for the sake of being an island. But the way in which these seas are described, they're all very different, but all showing us that there's something almost impenetrable about it. It keeps this country very separate to the rest of the world. And then we get, in our third paragraph, this explained to us very clearly, the other world, the old world, the land hemisphere. So we have the water hemisphere and the land hemisphere, so creating binary oppositions within this passage. So we can see here lots of literary devices being used to construct a very clear representation of Australia. You can go on and read more of For Love Alone if you like. You might also like to read it. It is on the text list. If we jump forward a little bit further, we see another Australian writer who you're probably more familiar with and is a Western Australian and attended Curtin University. His name is Tim Winton. He writes a lot about water. He writes a lot about Australia. So that we can see some clear connections between his work and Christina Stead's that we looked at previously with For Love Alone. In one of his pieces of writing, which isn't on the syllabus, but is certainly a well-known piece of memoir writing, he says, it's called Land's Edge, he says, Australians are surrounded by ocean and ambushed from behind by desert, a war of mystery on two fronts. And I think this speaks nicely to that idea that we were talking of in the first part of the lecture about mythologies and how we substitute things within our experience that we don't understand with things that might be bizarre within Australian identity. But certainly here we see the militaristic discourse that Winton uses to describe this land, that it's always about endurance. Being an Australian and being part of the Australian landscape, it's always about endurance, that we're surrounded by sea and ambushed from behind, a war of mystery. So we can see that language being used there. If we go to something that you might have studied, Cloud Street, which is on the literature text list, you can see a slightly different idea that he puts forward about the Australian landscape, but also about Australian people. He says, "Will you look at us by the river, the whole restless mob of us on spread blankets, in the dreamy, briny sunshine, skylarking and shayaking about for one day, one clear, clean, sweet day, in a good world in the midst of our living. Yachts run before an unfelt gust with bag-necked pelicans riding above them. The city, their twitching backdrop, all blocks and points of mirror light down to the water's edge. Now, this time we don't get that militaristic discourse. We don't feel like these characters are under threat in any way. We feel that they are very much part of their landscape, that they very much inhabit this riverfront location. And it's Matilda Bay, if any of you have been there, but certainly a landscape that people in Perth are very familiar with. What's interesting here is also about language. So if we had discourse, a militaristic discourse being used in that first example from Winton that speaks directly to those mythologies of Australian literature and Australian representation outlined earlier, this one speaks to something a little bit different. It very much speaks to that egalitarian idea of Australian representation. And we can see this being created through the language that is used, this whole restless mob of us, okay, mob being the collective term there. Then we've got quite specific Australian idiom or vernacular being used, so skylarking and shayaking about. Bag-necked pelicans, this idea of, this very iconic bird of Australian waterways. So lots of things that we can look at within Winton's work that draws our attention to a continuation of that identity and mythology that has been part of Australian literature from quite some time, by the time Winton's writing this in 1990. So what can we say about Australia now-ish, around about now? It seems like now-ish to me at my age, but probably seems a little way ago for you. But the 1980s to the present, we can really talk about as contemporary Australian literature, and that's those two examples from Winton come at that time. But what we start to see is that Australia, through its literature, begins to interrogate ideas of Australia. That those ideas about masculine identities begin to be interrogated. That we start to see women's stories emerging. That we start to say, hang on, these ideas of heroes in Australia, well, at whose cost was that heroic tradition being established? We also start to see an Australian nationalism emerging because of quite significant historical moments like the Australian bicentenary, where we start to say we don't have to be connected to Britain any longer. We can jettison that idea of a cultural cringe, of feeling embarrassed about Australia lacking its own culture. We've established our own self-identity. So, in the 1980s, we start to ask questions around those stories that have been told. Why were there no women? Why are there no Indigenous figures? Why are there no immigrant characters? Why are they all British? And what we start to see is that we have moved into a period of interrogation where we start to see multicultural stories emerge, but most importantly, we start to see post-colonial representations of Australia and a post-colonial identity emerge. Part 3 of our lecture looks at contemporary representations, so revisions and perspectives. That's what we're going to focus on in this section. Now, as I mentioned in the second part of the lecture, 1988, we had a bicentenary moment, a moment of historical significance where we started to look back on 200 years of white Australian history. Now, with that interrogation, looking back over 200 years, there was a newfound confidence that came about, but also an anxiety. So we had a paradox emerging. So confidence, but also being anxious. Some people, some scholars have called this schizoid Australian, where we've been looking at celebration, but also protest. We've been looking into the inquiry into deaths in custody. After that came the Mabo decision. After that, a Bringing Them Home report on the stolen generations. We started to really question, after 200 years of white settlement, well, what has that meant to the Australian cultural identity? These are important questions, and it takes quite a lot of time for thinkers. And if we think back to the Indaimo and Baski quote at the beginning of the lecture, it's that idea of the words of the tribe, that these words have to come back to us in some way. We have to start listening to literature and interrogate how we understand our own stories. And this is really the period, our contemporary period in Australian literature now. That's what we're talking about. This is a revisionist moment. We're revising our history. Historians have been doing it, but also writers have been doing it. We've been writing a lot of historical fiction, and there have been lots of historical films as well. We've started to revise that idea of the Australian legend. We also have acknowledged that we're really very much a coastal Australia, and we live in urban and suburban spaces for the most part. We're not all living as part of the bush. There's also many homosexual Australians, non-binary Australians, and these are stories that have been overlooked until this contemporary period as well. There's also non-Anglo-Australians. And so our contemporary moment is a time where stories of the experiences of migration have come into Australian literature as well. There's also been an interrogation of capitalism within Australia, of progressing at any cost. We've also begun to renegotiate nature and think, well, what is this land that we have inherited? And how might we come to understand a different relationship with that land? We've focused on poverty and crime being things that aren't necessarily things to idolise or be part of our mythology as something to look back on nostalgically, but maybe confront them in our own contemporary period. We've also started to recognise apocalyptic Australia coming through. So I guess times that are more dystopian than utopian. So in our literature in contemporary times, these are some of the themes that we tend to notice: ideas of belonging, dealing with guilt, understanding the limitations of traditional national identity, the connection between violence and masculinity, trauma, reconciliation, atonement, and family experience, the intergenerational understanding of how we understand this landscape. Bruce Dawe is an urban or suburban poet, a man who grew up in our eastern states and has only recently passed away, in actual fact. Many of you might have come across Bruce Dawe in Year 11. This is an opportunity for you to just put some texts into the discussion that we're having. So pause now and think about Homo suburbiensis. This is a sonnet, if you haven't quickly counted the lines, which hopefully you have. But think about the way that Bruce Dawe is using the sonnet form, along with other poetic devices, to make a statement about Australian suburban identity. It's a really helpful poem to help us to understand more contemporary representations of Australia. So hopefully Dawe has given you some ideas there. And what we're going to think about here is perspective. Because when we have representations constructed within a text, offered within a text, what we often find is that they're underpinned by certain perspectives. So your glossary, the literature glossary, gives you the definition of perspective being the way a reader or viewer is positioned by the author through the text, or how a particular ideology is embedded in the text, for example, a feminist perspective. The term perspective may also refer to the ideological perspective, the values and attitudes that a reader may bring to the text, and it may refer to the reading practice or lens used to read the text. For example, a feminist perspective, a post-colonial reading practice, a Marxist perspective, a psychoanalytical reading of a text. So this is what perspective means, the position that an author might bring to the text, what we might bring to the text, or a lens that we might apply to the text. Now, this has to be more than just an idea. It's a position. It's something thought through. It's underpinned by a lot of contextual knowledge, and that's important to remember. Perspective is underpinned by contextual knowledge. But perspectives underpin those representations as well. So, if we move to Oyster Cove by Gwen Harwood, another very popular poet in ATAR literature, we can see here another sonnet. So just like Bruce Dawe, using the sonnet form. And with this, I want you to think about not just what representations of the Australian landscape and Australian figures might you see here, but what perspective might be being offered by this text in terms of an ideological position. And if you think back to that idea of post-colonialism, interrogating the idea of colonialism, we can see a lot of this in Oyster Cove. So pause, read through, analyse this text, but think about it not just in terms of a representation, but how it also offers a perspective. So Gwen Harwood's work can very much be seen as offering a post-colonial perspective. We don't have to apply a post-colonial lens to it because it's already embedded within the text. But if we think about this poem here, White Stucco Dreaming, by Indigenous poet Samuel Wagan Watson, we can see a more contemporary landscape being explored. We can also see some different poetic structures coming forward. We can also talk about an embedded Indigenous perspective within this particular poem as well. So while we could talk about a post-colonial perspective being embedded within Gwen Harwood's work, that she's looking at that Indigenous experience through her own context, she's looking at it from a white Australian's perspective. She's looking from a post-colonial perspective. Here with Samuel Wagan Watson, we can still see it as a post-colonial perspective. It's certainly interrogating those same ideological positions, but he's coming at this from an Indigenous perspective as well. So pause, read, enjoy his work. It's a beautiful poem, but also think about the way that the poetic devices are helping us to understand the representations as well as perspective. So these have been some poems that help us to understand identity, representation, as well as perspective. But what you need to think about is that your cultural identity is connected to national perspective, that place, historical context, personal influences, experience, education, popular culture, cultural engagement, these are all of our contextual factors that give us a particular perspective. And we certainly here in Australia have a national perspective, as any nation state does. When it comes to Australian literature, we often see these aspects of cultural identity being communicated through the texts that have been created by our writers. This is certainly the case in Australian historical novels. And in those novels, we see a re-examination of our past, our cultural identity, as well as those marginalised identities that have been absent from the dominant Australian cultural identity. We often see post-colonial perspectives being offered, Indigenous perspectives. We even see revisionist perspectives, where you go back to the past and retell it in a way that was maybe omitted in the first telling of the history. A good example of an historical novel is written by Curtin's own Professor of Creative Writing, Kim Scott, a double Miles Franklin winner. That Dead Man Dance is a story of Indigenous frontier experience set on the south coast of Western Australia. That Dead Man Dance is a great novel, and here we have just the very beginning of the prologue. So what you'll see is Bobby Wabbalongany, who is the central figure of our story. And he's experimenting with language. He's understanding his place as somebody that has to translate language as part of that frontier experience. He's also understanding what it is to live in a conflict zone, a frontier moment. And we see the interaction between Bobby and his environment as something that is really important in this first part of the passage. So he says kaya. This means hello, or it means yes in Noongar language. And Bobby goes on to explain this. So your job with this particular passage is to pause, look at the importance of language and how it helps to provide an Indigenous perspective of this frontier moment. So some of the things you might have seen by looking at that excerpt from the prologue of That Dead Man Dance is that the Indigenous perspective is really brought forward to us by a naive voice, Bobby's voice. There's an authenticity of the Indigenous experience that comes forward here. It's also an unknown story of settlement. We haven't got many Indigenous perspectives on that moment of settlement, but what we see is that there is a lack of agency for the Indigenous figure, Bobby. Okay, he has to learn the new language. No one's going to learn his language from that settler culture. He also has to give up his space. So there's a lack of agency for that Indigenous figure. This Indigenous perspective also acknowledges that history is recorded through the dominant power in Australian settlement, because Bobby's acknowledging that he has to make concessions. He has to be the one to adapt to this new culture. This second passage comes from the end of the prologue, and this is Bobby again giving up his space, in this time to another person, so to Conch. Conch just means boss in Indigenous Noongar language. And we see the proximity of these two figures being a really important thematic development in this prologue. They have to inhabit this same tiny space. They can smell each other. They have to be in each other's breath. It's a really intense moment within this passage. So again, pause, read, analyse the language and try and pick up how we're understanding a particular post-colonial position within the text. So this second passage really does interrogate colonial history by placing our two figures alongside each other in this confined space. So this becomes a metaphor for the larger frontier settlement that we have of King George Sound in the novel, but then again for that entire experience of Australia as a country. So it's challenging the ideology of colonialism, and it renegotiates agency of the subaltern, the Indigenous figure. The way that it's renegotiating that agency is that we are sympathetic to Bobby at this moment, or empathetic. So we understand Bobby's experience, and we're seeing this from his side of things. We're being given his experience, his own way of coping with this very challenging circumstance. So this brings us to the end of our lecture. Hopefully this gives you a really sort of tight and brief understanding of both Australian cultural history and Australian literary history. And hopefully you'll be able to now place your texts in amongst this sort of timeline that's been given to us. So remember, the three parts of our lecture set forward three different timeframes where we see changes in Australian representations in literature, as well as changes in the Australian cultural identity. I'm going to leave you with a quote from a character from Baz Luhrmann's film Australia, Nulla. And he says, "One thing I know, we tell stories. That's how you keep those people belonging always." And this brings us back to that quote at the beginning, that literature is the words of the tribe. It's something that helps us to interrogate ourselves. It helps us to move forward. So really, our challenge as scholars of literature is to look at works both within their context and within our own context, and try and understand how we can understand the stories of others to help us to understand that bigger human experience. Thanks very much.